Back When is sponsored by Seawe, the National Trust's photo printing partner. Every image captures a story. Seawe's support means the National Trust can protect our nation's memories by caring for and sharing our vast collection of historic photographs. Through our work together, we're uncovering precious and previously unseen images for everyone to enjoy. Discover our work snapshotting 200 years of history. Search online for Seawe, that's CEWE, and the National Trust. It's the beginning of the 13th century, and a daring rescue mission is underway. A disguised figure ventures deep into France to track down a young woman hidden away in secrecy. A stealthy and successful mission, but unknown to rescuer and rescuee at the time, this act would change the course of history and enable one of the most successful and formidable women in medieval England. This is the tale of Ela, Sheriff of Wiltshire. Have you ever imagined being a fly on the wall of history? Join me for an inside view of the stories of people, places, and moments that made us. I'm historian Helen Antrobus, and lean in for a tale from time back when.
Ela of Salisbury is one of the most important people for Lacock's story.
This is Emma, part of the team at Lacock in Wiltshire, where Ela founded its abbey and set about growing the village surrounding it.
She was born around 838 years ago now in Amesbury, but she was the only child of William Fitzpatrick, who was the second Earl of Salisbury and an immensely powerful man.
In 1187, the year Ela was born, England was still in the early stages of establishing its monarchy, its nobility, and establishing who was and wasn't in power. England had its king, and then a series of counties in which a representative of the crown would hold office. In Wiltshire, this was William Fitzpatrick, who took on the role of Sheriff of Wiltshire when Ela turned 3.
So she grew up at Old Sarum in Salisbury, and that was basically the centre of power in Wiltshire. And she inherited all his power and wealth essentially when he died, when she was only 9 years old. Because her father was so wealthy and important and powerful, she then became a real target for fortune hunters, in a sense, to use the more modern phrase. So her uncle was said to have been really interested in taking that power and wealth for himself. So the story goes that she was kidnapped and taken to Normandy and imprisoned in a castle so that he could eventually keep her sort of long enough and usurp the power.
However, upon her father's death, Ela had become the king's ward, meaning that her power and her land was being held until she came of age.
King Richard essentially sent a knight over to Normandy to try and find her. And the story goes that this knight, William Talbot, went from castle to castle around Normandy, just singing under the windows and trying to essentially get her to sing with him so that he could locate where she was and then rescue her. He did manage to find her, and that he then brought her back to England and presented her to King Richard.
While this rescue took place, battles were happening across England and Europe as the nobility jostled for power. A knight in these battles and one of the king's best warriors was a man named William Longspay.
William Longspay was the illegitimate son of Henry II, and therefore half-brother to Richard the Lionheart, who was king at the time, and also Bad King John, also his half-brother. So it was quite common to marry off the offspring of royalty to heiresses. So Richard the Lionheart decided to reward William for all his hard work in battle and loyalty by essentially giving him the country's greatest heiress. So, I mean, he was in his 20s and she was 9. That doesn't feel terribly comfortable these days, but they wouldn't have consummated that marriage for quite a while afterwards, but they did essentially get married.
For Ela, the return to England must have been incredibly daunting and overwhelming.
I try and think, what would a 9-year-old have felt when you're told you're going to marry this man. And William Longspay, his name, the name Longspay comes from long sword, because he was supposed to have been an incredibly tall man who had used oversized weapons and so known as really fearsome in battle. I think she must have felt really, really quite scared potentially, but it does seem on the surface as if they could have had a happy marriage. They had 8 children, 4 boys and 4 girls. They had a relatively long marriage for the times. It was roughly sort of 20 plus years.
Because of their marriage, the title and power of Sheriff of Wiltshire and the earlship was inherited by William Longspay from Ela. But bad deeds and plans were afoot to try and usurp this prestigious position. If William was removed from the picture and Ela could remarry, then there could be a new sheriff in town. But Ela had plans of her own.
When William went off to battle one time, he ended up being shipwrecked. And the rumour got back to England that he died. And somebody else, another nobleman, came along to Ela and said, can I marry you? You know, William's gone. Can I marry you now? And she said, absolutely not. I don't believe he's dead. No, go away. Leave me alone.
William did return, but died shortly after. So once again, Ela was standing up for herself boldly in a man's world.
It would have been really quite unusual for a noblewoman at that time with that kind of wealth and status to not get married again. She would have had to argue that point really quite strongly. The chances are that she made a plan that she definitely wasn't going to. So through her, William had become the 3rd Earl of Salisbury, but with his death, the title went back to Ela. So had Ela married again, the chances are her husband would have taken that title. So by not marrying, she's protecting that title for her son, which is one reason she potentially chose to. But also, this is a woman who ended up being Sheriff of Wiltshire, a very powerful woman. She's used to being in charge of her own life. And if she got married again and had married somebody perhaps not as nice or as maybe she didn't get on with as well as William, then she could have found herself in a very different situation. So by not marrying, she remained sort of master of her own life. And I wonder if that's what she chose to do and planned to do by founding Lacock.
Over the next few years, Ela would take control of the county and see off numerous challenges to her right as sheriff.
They had to make sure they kept fighting for that position. And the fact that she had it and held it for a good few years is really, really impressive. So she would have been essentially running the county, collecting all the debts. She would have looked after all the royal land. She would have been able to raise the hue and cry, which is sort of effectively getting everyone together to find felons and people who've done things they shouldn't have done. She would have been able to gather people together had there been a war, so she would have been able to call everyone to arms in her part of the country, and she would answer to the king and be his representative in that part of the country. I just think that's a fantastic thing for a woman in the 13th century to be doing, especially as other people were trying to take it out of her hands all the time. You know, there's a woman doing this really important role that should really be in the hands of a man, but she kept it. So she's a very impressive lady.
One reason she may have been able to see off any potential suitors was because she and her now deceased husband held a copy of Magna Carta.
Her husband, William, was present at the signing of Magna Carta, which is one hell of an event in British history. And when the Magna Cartas were signed, they went off to the earldoms all over the country. So there were several copies of Magna Carta. And William and Ela, when they were living in Old Sarum, the castle there presiding over Wiltshire, they had their own copy of Magna Carta. That really should have carried on to the next sheriff. However, Ela decided to bring it to Lacock. Ela would have really struggled to resist getting married when she didn't want to after William's death. But there is a potential that she would have used Clause 8 of Magna Carta, which specifically says no widow is to be distrained to marry while she wishes to live without a husband. I love the thought that she actually had that document in her keeping, so she may have been able to say, here's the reasoning, you can't make me do this. And she obviously did manage to avoid marriage, so it worked.
After becoming sheriff, Ela turned her attention to the community and set about creating a long and lasting legacy founding 2 religious houses and growing the villages around them, Lacock Abbey and Hinton Priory, for which she laid both foundation stones over 16 miles apart in a single day.
Ela was absolutely instrumental in setting up Lacock as we know it now. Without her choosing this site and doing the things like getting a charter so that they could have a weekly market here, that kind of things meant that they could really build up trade and make this area self-sufficient again. So the village that she helped build is still here today. So people come round and look at this absolutely stunning place, and that's all because of the work she did to get land, to build up the trades in the local area and make sure that everybody in this community was being looked after.
After founding the abbey, Ela was then elected as its first abbess.
So originally at the convent there was no abbess. They had a woman who was in charge, but it wasn't at that point known as an abbess. However, I think Ela probably always intended to retire to the abbey. She spent the first sort of 7-8 years of the life of the convent getting more land for it, doing everything that she could sort of outside of the monastic order to sort of build the status and provide all she could sort of on the outside, so to speak. But then she decided to join herself. She was there for less than a couple of years before she was then elected as abbess herself. So you got to think that that would have been relatively democratic, but I think the other nuns must have seen her as quite a really important, powerful, respected person. And then she was abbess here for around 15 years or so, and it was only in the last 5 years of her life, when she started to get older and unwell, that she decided to give up being an abbess and just become a sort of one of the regular order and end her days here. I can't imagine what life must have been like for Ela, but from age 9 to become a countess in her own right, to be married off before the age of 10, to then be wife to the Sheriff of Wiltshire and then become sheriff herself as a woman in a man's world to such an extreme, and to manage that situation really well, and then to found not 1 but 2 religious institutions and then be elected abbess of the second one. I mean, she is a rather awe-inspiring lady to me.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of Back When, and do follow, rate and review us on your favourite podcast app. If you like the sea, land and stories about people and wildlife, why not check out Wild Tales from National Trust Podcasts? I am sure you'll enjoy it. Join us again next time for more tales from time back when. This podcast is sponsored by Siwi, Europe's leading photo printing company. Every image you capture tells a story. Discover ideas for curating and creating your special memories and unique gifts for loved ones. From high-quality, personalised photo books to wall art made from your favourite photos. Head to Siwi, that's cewe.co.uk, and start creating your story.